Welcome to NCM's Get Wise. Today we are actually in session 17, and we're going to look at the chapter 14 of the book of Proverbs. So once again, I say this every time, but if this is your first time tuning into our video, we have 13 of these videos ahead of us that walks through the first 13 chapters of Proverbs, and today's is chapter 14. Either go back and maybe watch some of those other ones, or you can just tune in today and then see what's going on. The cool thing with this chapter, as we've seen over the last really 3 chapters, and we'll continue seeing over the next 2 chapters, we see some of these just like Solomon wise remarks that he is leaving for his son. And that way they get this wisdom of Solomon. Which is really amazing because, and one of the reasons I really love the book of Proverbs is I just have in my mind this image of King Solomon knowing that his child is on the way and wanting to leave on this wisdom for them. So before we jump in today, I want you to go ahead and pause this video and think through what is the wisest advice you received from your parents, either your mom or your dad. What is something wise that they told you? So go ahead and pause and think about one of the wisest things they've told you, just kind of as we think through this. All right, as you've thought through what that wise advice that your parents gave you, one of the wisest things my dad actually told you, both my mom and my dad are super wise. I'm really thankful that I got to live with them for so long and have them in my life. But one of the wisest things my dad ever told me was not to put potatoes above, like in a cabinet or something high that you can't really see, but putting it somewhere low where not a whole lot of moisture gets to it. And the reason that this has actually happened to me twice, is because when you don't pay attention to potatoes and you forget about them for a pretty long time, they actually turn into this watery mush that just kind of like, and so a potato bag doesn't really keep that all together, and so it makes this huge smelling mess that makes you want to throw up. And so that's just one of the pieces of advice that is really practical that my dad's taught me. And there's a lot of other advice that he's given me, but that was just one of the practical fun ones I want to share with you. So keep an eye on your potatoes. But as we jump into today's passage, we're going to see a bunch of really solid advice from King Solomon, and really good wisdom. Today we're going to do this a little bit different. In the past, I've had you read the chapter first, and then I give you some questions. Today I want to give you 3 verses that I specifically looked at that I really loved. I want to share those with you, give you a question, have you think about it, and at the very end I'm going to have you pause, read through the chapter, and take some notes. So as we look at the first verse I want to share with you, it actually comes from verse 10 of chapter 14 of the book of Proverbs, and it says this: "The heart knows its own bitternesses, and no stranger shares its joy." Once again, this is verse 10. Let me read that one more time. "The heart knows its own bitterness, and no stranger shares its joy." And so I want you to go ahead and pause this video, read that verse, that's verse 10, and think about this question. What bitternesses are your heart carrying? So what is the bitterness in your life you may not have realized up to this point? You may know about it, and as soon as you heard this question, you're like, oh, I have this bitterness I can deal with. But what is some of that bitterness that your heart is holding that no other stranger or person around you knows about? So go ahead and pause, write that in your journal, what that bitterness is. All right, so now that you've kind of identified what is this bitterness in your heart, I think a challenge when we look at what do we do with bitterness, we see here that what we need to do is we need to give this to the Lord. The bitterness that's unknown doesn't help anything, and so we need to address it. And so we address it first with the Lord, and then from there we can address who that bitterness is with or what that bitterness is for. So that's just something I challenge you as you're looking through is, man, what is the bitterness in my life, and how am I addressing it? Am I addressing it? The next verse I want you to take a look at is verse 12. Let me go ahead and read this out loud. "There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is their way to death." Once again, that's verse 12. Let me read it one more time. "There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is their way to death." And I think we see this all the time, that we have this image of, or this idea of And this is the right way. This is the right way to study. That's one of the reasons. If you were like me, the first midterm was always awakening of I studied poorly. And the way that I prepared for the test and the way that I thought about the test was wrong because I got in the first test and it's what all my buddies told me to do, and I didn't do well because I didn't study correctly. But we see this in a lot of other ways too, and how we see God and how we get to Him. That there's this way that in the minds of mankind, we think this will lead to a relationship with God, but in reality, it's going to leave us away from God. And so I want you to go ahead and pause right now and think through this question of where in culture do we see this happening? Where mankind or even ourselves or our friends are thinking this way will lead to something that we think will be successful, that will bring us joy, but in reality, it actually leads to death and destruction. So go ahead and pause and think through that question. All right, welcome back again. That's always the awkwardness of these videos, is this pausing time coming back, so thanks for doing that with us. So as we look at one final verse I want to share with you before I have you take a look at the whole chapter, is in verse 13. And I think this is I just really love this verse. And it says this: even in laughter, the heart may ache, and the end of joy may be grief. Let me read that one more time. That's verse 13. Even in laughter, the heart may ache, and the end of joy may be grief. Man, how profound is that verse? So what I want you to do is go and take some time and journal over this question of when was a time in your life that you were laughing and having fun, but at the same time your heart was aching, or you didn't have that joy or the peace in your life. What caused that? What led to that? Why were you happy in that moment, but your heart was aching? And also on that idea of how do those go together? How can you be laughing, but your heart be aching? And so maybe that you haven't had that time in your life. So also think through that question. So go ahead and pause. Think through that question. When was a time in your life that your heart was aching, but you're still laughing? All right, go ahead and pause and think through that. All right, great. As we look at in this season, if you're going through with us day by day, we've kind of entered in this week of Easter season. Easter's on Sunday, so celebrating Jesus' death and resurrection, and preparing for that in kind of this final week before. And I think this final question I think leads us to a really sweet time, as we see through Scripture. There's a lot of people that went through physical suffering, like Jesus himself, who died on the cross. But at the same time, he had this joy and love for those around him. We see this with Stephen in Acts 7, verse 54, who was this early disciple of Jesus. He didn't actually walk with Jesus specifically, but he was somebody that knew and followed Jesus. But he was actually stoned by Saul. But his final words were, "God, forgive them," because he had such a love for those that even that were leading to his death. So what joy did he have in his life? I think as we think about this season, it's so beautiful what Jesus did on the cross, because he suffered the death that we deserve so we can be in a relationship with him. And so I want you to take some time and think through, man, as you're reading through chapter 14, at the end of it, everything points to Jesus in some way. But how can, when we have a relationship with Jesus, when we trust that he came back from the grave, that he rose 3 days later, how can our lives have joy in everything that we're doing? Even in the season of quarantine, how can we still have joy, even when we can't be with our family or our friends like normal? So I want you to go ahead and pause, read through the book of this chapter 14 of Proverbs, thinking through that question, but then also pointing out some of the other verses in this that you like. So I'll leave that with you. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.